My name is Sabine Pahl. I'm a professor of environmental psychology at the University of Vienna. And the focus of this video is on the human dimension, particularly how people deal with the really bad news we see all the time. What I hope people will learn is some of the context, the interdisciplinarity, how we need to address these issues, and also take away perhaps some practical tips on how to deal with this. My topic today is climate anxiety and coping. So on the one hand, the scary side, the range of negative emotional responses people have to the changes we're seeing and we will be seeing in the future. And on the other side, how we can deal with them, what strategies exist. Let's start by setting the context a bit. I'm interested in climate change for a range of reasons. First, I think it is already, and it will be in the future, one of the biggest challenges for humankind. The science is absolutely clear that people are changing the climate through greenhouse gas emissions, and it's really urgent that we address this challenge, that we reduce emissions and try to protect the climate, but also that we adapt to the changes that are already in motion. With that background, as an environmental psychologist, I'm particularly focusing on the health effects of climate change, and within that, on the mental health challenges we see and that are coming in the future. This graph from a US report summarizes some of the main issues for context. On the left in red, you see some manifestations of climate change, from temperature increase to disasters and extreme weather. Then in blue, some effects from heat to pollution and changes in infectious diseases. Then when you look at the dark blue box, what are the health effects we're observing? There are many different ones, from acute illness, e.g. in very hot weather, to more chronic conditions, injuries and death. And they are not equally distributed in the population. We need to consider vulnerabilities and social justice on top of this. Amongst all these different aspects, I want to focus on mental health, here highlighted by the blue box. And while this sounds quite gloomy when we think about it, and this is exactly the topic today, I also want to point out already that we can do an awful lot as individuals, in communities, and as decision makers to soften the impacts, to protect and prepare people. That's the rightmost box you can see here. One key thing is preparedness, whether this means infrastructure, communication systems, building skills and knowledge in the community. So if something happens, people spring into action. So what do we mean by climate anxiety? It's a fairly new concept, so there is actually no one definition in the literature. It's also referred to as eco-anxiety, eco-grief, or climate doom. And there are different tools, different ways of assessing it. Here's one survey tool that has been used quite a lot, which distinguishes two types of impairment, cognitive and emotional versus functional impairment. So for example, effects of thinking about climate change, cognitive responses such as not being able to sleep, emotional responses like questioning one's own reaction. At the bottom, there's a social dimension and also not being able to enjoy oneself, which is part of it. Early research here showed that 17 to 27% of people respond above the midpoint of sometimes. So it's not a trivial percentage. Another way of assessing climate anxiety is by focusing more on the direct emotions. My colleague Charles Ogunbode did this fantastic study across 28 countries, asking a range of things: how calm, tense, relaxed, anxious, peaceful, worried or terrified about climate change people felt at that moment in time. So it's a much more direct, in-the-moment response. You can see quite a lot of variation, but overall it's not that similar to the percentages I just showed you before. Between 20 and 40% of people in the majority of countries said they were very or extremely anxious about climate change, the blue bars. And for expressing worry, this was even higher, the yellow bars. In their study, they also showed that higher climate anxiety related to higher exposure to climate information, higher pro-environmental behavior, and lower mental well-being. So there is an association with attention to climate-related news, paying attention to these things, but people also report doing more to protect the climate. And finally, people tend to not feel great when they have higher climate anxiety, which is not surprising. What do people do in response? They see the news, they might see coverage of climate impacts just like you in the audience, and they feel terrible about it, anxious, worried. What happens next? There are two major types of responses derived from the stress literature. And there's emotion-focused coping on the one hand, dealing with a stressor through regulating the uncomfortable emotions it creates. You really focus on the emotions. You de-emphasize the threat, you deny the problem, really trying to deal with those emotions. Then there's problem-focused coping, where you actively address the problem, focusing on solutions. What can I do? You seek information, you're being proactive. A more recent addition to these two types of coping was meaning-focused coping, where you're fostering positive emotions such as hope instead of just down-regulating negative emotions. So for this, you try to find meaning. You think about growing from this challenge. You think about positive outcomes from the challenge. These types of copings are associated with different outcomes. If you engage in emotion-focused coping, you tend to think you can't do anything. You have weaker efficacy beliefs, and you do less to protect the climate. You engage less in pro-environmental behavior. If you use problem or meaning-focused coping, it's the opposite. The coping strategies adopted have also been found to correlate with communication patterns. It's a social thing. For example, in adolescent samples, there was a dismissive, doom and gloom-oriented communication pattern in the family, whereas adolescents who displayed problem or meaning-focused coping, the researchers observed solution-oriented and supportive communication patterns in the family. Whether this is causal or correlational, this is not so clear in the existing data. But of course, as a psychologist, I immediately think there are ways of intervening in communications, helping people communicate better. Finally, and this is important, there's also some evidence emerging that doing something helps people cope with climate change anxiety, and in particular, collective action. Doing something with other people, getting together, sharing the concern and addressing it, is better than individual action, where one does not connect with others. This is worth remembering and building on. I wanted to finish with some positive thoughts, partly because I really feel that we often don't communicate well about these issues, maybe because they raise emotions, they're scary, they're threatening. Maybe it's uncomfortable to have these discussions. And it questions many things we're taking for granted. And I also think that different sides don't necessarily communicate well. If you're protective, if you're defensive, maybe if you're a climate skeptic, you just turn away. If you're a climate activist, you might overdo it sometimes and turn people off. So if you get into a situation where you talk about climate change, if you want to engage in this, here are some tips. First thing is respect diverse views. Respect what the other person has to say. Find some common ground between you. Ask some questions to understand. Listen carefully and keep connected in the discussion. Acknowledge negative emotions. Different people feel frustrated for different reasons. Don't judge, blame, or shame the other person, regardless of where they're coming from, and empower people to respond in their way. Also, the final thing I want to say is we're not alone in this. The World Economic Forum, this is a forum of leaders, economic leaders, governments. They ask every year about the likely impact and the likely severity people are expecting right at the top, very high level. And they talk about in 2 years' time, they talk about in 10 years' time. In 10 years' time, it's very clear they're aware climate change is the top of the agenda. It's one of the major problems we see and we need to deal with.